All right. Welcome, everyone. We are starting our Farm Management Friday webinar series today, focusing on using farm financials to make informed decisions. What financial tools are available and how do you evaluate alternatives? My name is Katie Wantoch, Farm Management Outreach Specialist with Extension, and I am joined by Kevin Bernhardt. Kevin, why don't you introduce yourself?
Oh, thank you, Katie. Kevin Bernhardt here. Have a split appointment. Part of my time is with UW Extension, Division of Extension, as a farm management specialist. And I also spend some time teaching in the ag business program down at UW Platteville.
Oh, great. So questions, sometimes, Kevin, these questions come in to us, from farmers or ag professionals. And, it's always kind of a struggle about how to help them and how to answer them. So, farmers might have a question like, will I be able to cover my debt obligations for this coming year? How much working capital should or do I need to have? Do I have too much debt? Am I profitable or profitable enough? Then we might get into looking at some investments. Should I invest in robots or, maybe on-farm storage if they have extra grain or machinery? Or we might get into some really tough questions. How about my long-term viability? Is my farm going to keep going? What is my break-even cost of production and how do I calculate that? We are at the beginning of the year here, Kevin. And so it's, how am I going to pay my bills for this next year? And what if I have surplus? Because grain prices were pretty decent in 2022. So what does that look like for 2023? So I know that's a lot of questions, Kevin, but where do people get started?
Oh, those are great questions. And boy, aren't they common. We hear those kind of questions and others all the time. And producers are always, as they're riding in that tractor, as they're walking across that farmstead, as they're milking those cows, their minds are always turning, what can I be doing next to make this farm more profitable? What can I be doing next to provide more security in my business operations, et cetera, et cetera. They're always there. So the question is, how do we analyze those different kinds of questions? Are there tools out there that can help us have informed decision-making? It doesn't guarantee we're going to make the right decision. Life has a way of throwing a lot of curveballs at us, but certainly it can give us the information to make better decisions and to make more informed, data-driven decisions, if you will. And there is lots of tools, Katie. There's the ratios, the many ratios that can be calculated from a balance sheet and an income statement, that they themselves can start to tell a story about a farm. Where is profitability coming from? Or better yet, perhaps, what are the balls and chains that are holding profitability back? What can I do tomorrow morning after breakfast to be able to increase the potential for profitability in the future? How can I fix my liquidity? What should my liquidity be? In other words, how much working capital for my size of operation should I have? There are some tools and there are some different metrics that can help us answer that question. What kind of risks am I facing? There's some assessments that we can do to give us a feel for where we need to spend that time tomorrow morning after breakfast to make our farms more resilient to those different kinds of punches that we're certainly going to receive over the course of a year. Break-even analysis, budgeting, all different kinds of budgeting that we can do to answer those kinds of questions.
It kind of starts with financial statements, right? I mean, we both have talked until we're blue about making sure farmers have their financial statements put together and prepared, right?
It really does. There's a lot of neat tools, a lot of neat management processes that we can use to address these questions. But unfortunately, you do have to have that information that comes from an accurate and well done balance sheet, both a beginning of the year and end of the year balance sheet, as well as an accrual income statement, not just a cash income statement, but we really have to have that accrual income statement. That's a lot to do, just putting those financial statements together accurately. But that is where it starts. That's the foundation for being able to use a lot of these other tools. Now, we're not going to be talking about financial statements today. what we're going to be talking about is some examples of what are the neat things that you can do if indeed you do have that financial statement information.
Right. So let's kind of jump right into that. That's a good segue, Kevin. Financial tools you can use. And I think the first one that you have suggested is break-even analysis. So you've kind of highlighted a case farm here for us. We have Joe and Dan, and they're trying to make some marketing decisions on their dairy farm. 2022 was a great year for dairy farmers. The commodity price was high, almost record highs in the year. And, they're trying to decide, looking forward, the milk prices are still currently in the high levels. Should they do some marketing? What does that look like? Now, Joe is excited about the opportunities that are presented in the markets. Dan is not sure whether they should pull the trigger and go through that process. So, do you have suggestions and tools that they can use, Kevin?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a very common question that we receive all the time is, when do I market my milk? When do I market my corn and my soybeans? Boy, if we all had a crystal ball, wouldn't that be nice to be able to know exactly when that proper time is? But the one thing we can do is we can look to see if I do market my milk, or if I do market my corn and soybeans today with the price that's currently out in the marketplace, what have I done to myself? Have I met my cost of production? Does that price that I locked in, does that allow me to pay my cost of production? Or better yet, can I pay my cost of production and give myself a profit? And if so, how much? Well, there is a neat little tool, Katie, that we can use. It's called break-even price analysis. And it gives us not only information about marketing, but as you'll see here in a little bit, it gives us information about some other things too. It all starts with the profit equation. So the profit equation can be made complicated, but let's make it as simple as we can. And let's look at a milk example. So the profit equation is total revenues minus total costs. And total revenues is the price of milk that I get, the mailbox price I get, times the hundredweight of milk that I sell. And I'm going to subtract from that the cost of production, and I have my profits. Well, I can use a little bit of algebra there to be able to determine if I know what my profit goal is, if I know what my cost of production is likely to be, if I know what amount of hundredweights of milk I'm likely to sell, then I can take profits plus cost of production, divide it by hundredweights of milk, and I get my break-even price that I need. Now, if I get that price, then I've covered my cost of production and whatever I put in as my profit goal. So that is a pretty handy number to have when we're doing marketing and when we're doing some other things. Let's look at an example of Joe and Dan's farm. Let's assume they sell 53,000 hundredweights of milk over the course of a year. And their total dairy expenses based on historical evidence is probably likely going to be around $970,000. Their profit goal that they initially put out there, at least, is 100,000. So now let's use that break-even formula that we just discussed. Let's take that 100,000 profit goal, add it to the cost of production of 970,000, and then divide it by the number of hundredweights of sales of milk. And when we do that, we find out that we have to have a $20.19 price. Now, if we find a $20.19 price out in the marketplace and we lock it in, or we do a put option or some other kind of marketing tool, then we've assured ourselves that based on our expectation, based on our estimates, that we are covering our cost of production and we're covering our profit goal. Now, we might also want to know, how much do I need to get just to cover cost of production? Because we know sometimes life doesn't allow us to get that profit that we want. And in this case, if you do the same math, except for setting the profit goal to zero, then your break-even price analysis is going to be $18.30. So that is valuable information to have. Now, as we go and look at marketing, certainly it gives us that informed metric that we can use to make that marketing decision. or at least know what we've done to ourselves potentially if we do make that marketing decision. I think another way to look at this break-even price analysis work is the graph that you see on the screen in front of you is happens to show class 3 prices since 2010 up through June of 2021 in this case. And the black solid line that goes across is at about, I think it's about 1775 is where it's supposed to be. And if that is my break-even price, just looking historically, you can see the months when I would have made profit over that 1775 cost of production, and the months that I would have lost profit. Now, the other valuable thing you look at is where is yours at? So if you have a cost of production, let's put it at the $20 line. So just draw a line across at $20. And if that's the situation that you're facing, you've had struggles. You've had some struggles finding those profits. Too many times your cost of production was too high for the price that was offered. That gives us information for farm management as well. We know we got to do some work tomorrow morning after breakfast to bring down that cost of production, because the marketing just isn't going to be able to solve that problem all the time in that case. So that's a very quick and easy tool, Katie, that I think can be quite helpful for producers to have, is to know that cost of break-even price that they need to have to cover cost of production and their profit goal.
Right, exactly. So that was a great break-even analysis, one of our first examples here today. Next, Kevin, I think you kind of like to go into partial budgeting. And so it looks like you're kind of got Ethan. Ethan has been farming, and he utilizes some custom operators to come in and combine his corn and soybeans. Now, can you help us and Ethan consider buying his own combine versus comparing the costs to custom harvest?
Yeah, this is a great question, a very common question. Should I do this or should I do that? Should I invest in this technology or should I not? Or which technology should I invest in? These are very common questions. And one tool that's a handy and an easy to use tool in terms of the process, at least, of using it, and that's partial budgeting. So let's talk a little bit about what partial budgeting is. Partial budgeting takes a look at sort of a singular or partial change that you're making in your operation. So it's not good if your question is, should I milk cows or should I grow vegetables? It doesn't answer that question. That's a different tool for that. But it does help to answer the question, should I buy a combine or should I custom hire my combining be done? Should I invest in a robotic technology of some sorts or should I not? These kinds of questions are well suited for a partial budget. And how it works is you're really asking 4 questions. 2 of those questions will lead to extra profits in your pocket. 2 of those questions lead to less profits in your pocket. And you're just simply looking at the difference between the 2 then at the end. So the 4 questions are, if I launch this new idea that I have, if I make the change, what costs are going to be eliminated or reduced? If there's costs that are eliminated or reduced, that's increased profits for me. By the same token, what additional revenues might this change generate? The 2 together tell me what increase in profits I will have. By the same token, I might have decreases in profits by launching this new idea. So the next 2 questions are, what revenues will be eliminated or reduced if I launch this new technology or this change? Or what additional costs might be incurred if I make this change? I put those 2 together. We have a table that shows that how you can use this. So this is a table. I also have a spreadsheet version I can show you in a second when we talk about Ethan's question. But there's the 4 questions. So you can see on the far left is the question, what current costs will be reduced or eliminated? What new or additional revenues will be received? And then the questions in the green shaded area are what things are going to happen if I make this change that would negatively affect the finances that I'm facing. And we simply do the math at the end to see if we got a positive or a negative number. So let's take a look at an idea of this. And this is something I got from our colleague, Paul Mitchell. I think he used this to teach for one of his classes at one time, and it was a nice little case study. So looking at this idea of buying a combine versus custom hire. Ethan has 250 acres of corn. He has 250 acres of soybeans. Custom rates are $35 an acre for corn, $33 an acre for soybeans. If he buys the combine, he's going to have both ownership cost and operating cost. And you can see what the totals are for corn and soybeans there, $40 per acre, $38 per acre. If he does buy his own combine, then he thinks he can be more timely. And if he's more timely, he might get a bump in yield from his fields. So he's estimating that to be about 1% for both corn and for soybeans. And you got the yields there that he currently has, and you have the expected prices, which for today's markets look a little low. But those are the prices based on this particular scenario to start with. So when we put these all into our spreadsheet, we end up with a change of $200. So that would indicate to us that, hey, it's positive, right? It's positive. And so that means that if we were to make this change and buy the combine versus custom hire, we're going to earn $200 more. Now you might look at that and say, well, over 500 acres, earning $200 more. I'm not sure that is a big enough reason to make that change. So once you have the number, then there's certainly some other things that you want to look at to see if this makes sense overall. So what kind of risks are associated with it? How does it affect other parts of your operation? Maybe one of the reasons that you started custom hiring in the first place is you have a livestock operation that keeps you pretty busy and you're just not able to get out there and do that combining. So, other factors will certainly enter in there as you make your final decision. But part of that decision is what financial impact is it going to have? Now I'm going to show you the spreadsheet on this real quick. So I brought that up there. You see what that looks like. If this is based on additional yield of 1.8 and bushels per acre for corn and an extra almost a half a bushel for soybeans, if I change those and look at the number where it says 200, if I change those to say 2.5 extra bushels per acre for corn and 1.5 for soybeans, just for example, and I change the corn price to $4.50, and let's change the soybean price to $11. If I do all that, then all of a sudden I have $4,438 more dollars. And so that starts to take on more attention for me in terms of whether this is a good idea or not. So it's always good to do a sensitivity analysis around these questions as well, Katie, especially when we know the volatility of prices and costs and things like this. But the partial budget is a great way, an easy way, really, in terms of process of how to get our arms around the negative financial impacts and the positive financial impacts and see if it works out for us.
Yeah, and that was a great way to use that partial analysis going through, and that certainly is an article that we have on our topic hub. We'll provide the website at the end of our presentation. And so your spreadsheet is available for download there. So if people want to run through their own scenario, like you said, whether it's investing in, in this case, Ethan was looking at combine, but it could be any type of piece of equipment or technology as well. So that's great. Now, Kevin, there's one other financial tool that you suggest people kind of look at, and that is, trying to determine profitability, right? And how they can increase it and identify areas that are really challenging their profitability. And I think in this case, you've got Joan, and she certainly is wanting to increase her profitability, as most farmers do, and is looking for some help. So what financial tool can you suggest to her?
The DuPont system for financial analysis, Katie, is one of my favorite things to talk about. In part because we're talking about profitability. And, we can have challenges with solvency and liquidity and repayment capacity and a lot of these other kinds of issues. But all those things get solved over the long run if we have good profitability. So we really need to nail down and try to make our farms as profitable as we can. The DuPont system for financial analysis is a great financial tool to use that gives us insight into the three primary levers of profitability. And those three primary levers are true if you're a commodity farm business or you're an airline or a shoe store. It doesn't make any difference. Every business has to have these three levers in order to make profits. It starts with using our assets that we have, working those assets to create gross revenues coming in the door to start with. So I have to work my cows, I have to work my land, I have to work my tractors to create the gross revenues that are coming into the farm operation to start with. We can measure that through a ratio called the asset turnover ratio. The second lever of profitability is once I have the total revenues coming in, now I got to start paying my bills. Now I have to pay my expenses. So the more efficient I am with the cost of my inputs, the cost of my production practices that I'm using, the more efficient I am with those costs, that's going to allow me to keep as much of that gross revenue coming in as possible as net income or profits at the end of the day after all the expenses are paid. We can measure that efficiency as well with a ratio called the operating profit margin ratio. The last one is using leverage. So this is going to the bank or some other financial place to get additional money so I can buy more cows, buy more acres, buy tractors, whatever technology, whatever is needed to increase my profitable activities. I'm going to leave that last lever off going forward here because I'm just going to concentrate on the being able to make the revenues before borrowing money because that just adds another element to it. So I'm going to simplify that a little bit. And what you see on your screen now is just a sort of a nice little diagram that shows that if I take that asset turnover ratio, which is measuring how well I am using my assets to create revenues, if I multiply that by my efficiency of expenses measured by the operating profit margin ratio, then what I get as a result is the return on assets, which is one of the primary metrics for profitability that we often use. So then I could go backwards. I can go from right to left. So let's look at the next slide that we have where I look at my return on assets and it's too low. It's too low. And so it's got to be low because either the asset turnover ratio is low or because the operating profit margin ratio is low. I look and see that the operating profit margin ratio is okay. Well, if that's the case, then that means I'm not using my assets well enough to create revenues. The asset turnover ratio is too low. So that could be the prices I'm getting. That could be my production. It could be because I have some capital assets, some machinery, some buildings, some land that's not being very productive or that I'm not even using or certainly underutilizing. These are the kinds of things I might go out and check tomorrow morning after breakfast to see if I can pump up that getting more revenues out of the assets I have. And certainly it could be production practices like my cows are open too long and I'm not getting them rebred quick enough. That means I'm not working that asset. That cow's not coming back into the lactation as quickly as I would like it to. And that could be a reason why that asset turnover ratio is too low. But I know where to spend my time. I know where to spend my time now to increase that profitability. And of course, the opposite could be true too. The asset turnover ratio could be just fine, but it's the efficiency with expenses that's my problem. And in the example that's shown here, they tracked that back and they kept looking and they kept looking until they finally realized that their labor was way higher than what the average is for other farms their size. Now, quite frankly, it often doesn't come back to just one thing that I can fix. Usually it's my expenses across the board need some work. But I know where to spend my time if that's the case. Maybe I negotiate prices. Maybe I need some to invest in some technologies that allow me to be more efficient. Maybe there's fuel efficiency with some newer machinery there, whatever that case might be that is fitting for my farm. But the point is, I can use this neat little tool called the DuPont Financial Analysis System to really sort of isolate where it is that my profitability is being held back. And once I've done that, I know where to spend my valuable management time.
Yeah, that's great, Kevin. You've got a couple more things here that you usually like to talk about with the DuPont analysis, as you're looking at those assets and how to fix them. So, for example, I know a lot of people, myself, I'm closer to the Northwoods than you are in southern Wisconsin. And there's a lot of hunting land up here that may be listed on a farm's balance sheet, for example, that is certainly maybe not productive, is non-productive to the dairy farm, and if you can talk about, what that looks like in the DuPont analysis.
Sure, you bet. Yeah. The slide you have in front of you now is looking at if the asset turnover ratio is too low. Now, remember that asset turnover ratio is telling me that I'm not using my assets well enough. I'm not creating enough revenues for the assets I have. So something is going to miss there. Now that can either be a numerator problem or a denominator problem. It might mean that I'm not getting enough revenues for the assets I have, or sort of the reverse of that is I got too many assets for the amount of revenues being generated. So it's sort of a flip side of the same coin, but it does give us some things to look at. So let's assume, for example, that the denominator we believe is too big. So I have too many assets. Your example of having the extra land there that I'm not, I do some hunting on it, or perhaps I'm not using it. That might be a good example where the assets are a lot higher than the amount of revenue I'm generating. So what are some things I can look at? Well, do I have some excess machinery around that's really not working very hard? If so, maybe it's time to get rid of that. Maybe I need to look at leasing versus owning. That might be a possibility if it makes more sense to do so. If I can pencil it out, then I can use my partial budget to see if that's the case. Maybe I could share some assets. I'll share a story with you. One of my students down here was telling me about their home farm, where it's a fairly small farm. And I asked them, how things were going with them. And they had a lot of success, in large part, they said, because they had combined with several neighbors. And so there was 3 or 4 of them that were all kind of that smaller farm size, but they started sharing equipment. They started sharing a chopper. They started sharing a combine. They started doing a lot of asset sharing, so that only one, they each had 1/4 ownership, so to speak. And that really lowered the amount of assets that they had, but it created the revenue. It was a great way that these particular folks found to have a profitable, successful business. Land and buildings not being used. It could be an entire enterprise as well. There was another situation I recall where there was a milk enterprise, there was a cash crop enterprise, and a feedlot on this particular farm. We enterprised those out. In other words, we found out, which is another tool that we haven't talked about, by the way, is enterprise budgeting. We enterprised those out and found out that they were making good money on the milking operation. They were making good money on the cash grain operation, but they weren't doing very well at all on feeding out the steers. And so that was a situation where they just end up dumping that whole enterprise, got rid of all those assets, paid off the debts that were against it, and were a lot better off than in their financial situation. So that's a way that those fixes could be used. On the numerator side, how can you increase the amount of revenue that you're getting from the same set of assets that you have? How do you increase that productivity? Maybe it's mortality rates, maybe it's conception rates, maybe it's feed conversions, timeliness of operations. Can you get a premium for your price? Can you get discounts on your input purchases? These are the things that might help you be able to create greater revenues out of the assets that you already have. So there's a potential list of fixes. If it's an operating profit margin issue, I'm spending too much to get the revenues that I have. What are some things I can do there? Well, there's lots of production practices that we read about in the farm magazines all the time, for feed waste and for different kinds of tillage systems and different kinds of health protocols for our animals, etc., that might help us be more efficient with our expenses. We certainly can go and negotiate or try to create those lower input costs for ourselves, maybe through quantity purchases with ourselves or with other people. Negotiating more favorable rental arrangements on our land that we're renting, that might be a possibility. We mentioned the outsourcing or the partnership type idea, the alliances that might be created to help us be more efficient with our expenses as well. So lots of different things that can be done once we know that it's expenses that we have to work on.
Right. And labor, I know too, Kevin, unfortunately is increasing, and there's a real shortage of help on farms, especially. So that's one, I met with a farmer the other day, and they were considering upgrading their parlor in order to retain the labor that they do have. The labor has complained that they're milking cows for too long, and so they're actually going to maybe invest in a newer type of parlor equipment in order to reduce the labor and the hours that those employees are milking. So, the DuPont analysis really hones in on that they have a labor expense that's a little too high for the number of hours, especially, and what can you do? So between the DuPont analysis, partial budget, we briefly touched on enterprise budgeting today too, and then break even. Those are some great financial tools to really help farmers answer some questions.
Yeah, they really are. And they leave you to that insight as to where, I don't know. I haven't met any farmers, Katie, that say they have too much time on their hands, right? There's a shortage of time. So where do you spend your valuable time? And the more I can isolate and pinpoint where I'm going to get the biggest bang for the buck, the better. So your example of labor was a really good one. And if it happens to be, and it comes up so often, as you know, the labor situation, especially since the pandemic, it even exasperated it even more. But that labor issue has two sides to it, right? So it's, am I paying too much for labor, so to speak? But the other side of that coin is, can I do something to make my labor more productive? So can I get more revenue out of the labor I have? It's two ways to get to the same goal. And maybe the second one would even be better in a lot of cases. Is there some training that can take place? Is there some standard operating procedures that are needed to help that labor be more efficient and be happier, frankly? So yeah, there's a lot of ways to slice that apple.
Right, definitely. And you'll be able to find a lot of our information and the tools that we mentioned today on our farm management program's website, farms.extension.wisc.edu. And again, this is part of a Farm Management Friday webinar series. Also within UW Extension, we have a Badger Dairy Insight and Small Ruminant and Forage. He's also having a webinar series as well. So go to the website that's listed on your screen to go and find that valuable information as well as previous recordings. Again, thank you, Kevin, for your time today. And thanks all for listening.
Thank you.